submit to God, then that word is empty.
That I agree with.
Yes.
And the question is, why is it empty, right? Yeah. If you've said the words, why is it still empty?
And so I think that what he's grasping at is to find a more encompassing, it's like, stop asking me if I believe in God, watch me.
Yeah, okay. No, but I get what you're saying. But what I'm saying is this, is that the attitude that you have towards scientific investigation is that which is more congruent with a correspondence theory type understanding,
yes.
Right? So you simply ask the question that, by the way, the Quran asks. And one of the central questions the Quran asks us to ask, Christians and Jews, is قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Bring your evidence if you're truthful. This is the central question that Muslims are asked to ask. The same question that you, as a scientist, ask, we have to ask as well, right? And I'm using the word ask a lot here. What I'm saying is, this is where the cognitive dissonance may come in. I'm not saying
it does come in. So that is part of what's torn the West apart on, say, on the basis of the Enlightenment versus the religious tradition, to the degree that that's a conflict.
Just to add to this point is, for example, going back to Origin of Alexandria, yeah? Origin of Alexandria, because he has this hermeneutical dilemma. He has a hermeneutical dilemma, right? He doesn't know what to do with what verse. Is he going to spiritualize it, metaphorize it, or is he not going to do that? He was asked by an apologist called Celsus. He said, what do you say of the crucifixion? And he responds to an effect to say that not everything was true, what happened, right, in the crucifixion. Point is that when you open the can of worms of hermeneutical spiritualization or exegetical or, metaphorization, yeah? When you open that can of worms, what is left of Christianity is basically mythological. Now, then I will say, what makes this myth better than any other myth? Why are we investigating the myth of Christianity and not, for example, the myth of Hercules and Zeus? Why is the figure of Father and Son and the Holy Spirit more important to me than the Mithraic, Trinity?
Yeah, well, that's a postmodern question. And you could take that even farther and say, well, why this story rather than that story at any level of story? And that is a central question.
So how would you answer? Because why did you, if, for example, you've done a biblical lecture, right?
Yeah.
So why have you done a biblical lecture, not a lecture on Zeus and this and all these other...
Well, I have done lectures on other religious structures, particularly on ancient Egyptian cosmology and on Mesopotamian cosmology. And I'm going to do a lecture on the Tao Te Ching.
Sorry, do you consider the biblical narrative as having any level of superiority over the other mythologies?
Well, okay. So let me try to address this psychologically.
Oh, even he's interested now.
Well, yeah, because I am a Christian.
So I've been trying to understand. So I'll tell you one thing that clinical psychologists have learned over the last 100 years, despite their doctrinal differences. So there's many schools of clinical psychology, ranging from behaviorism, which is very practical and strategic, and has to do with micro changes in action, to psychoanalytic theory, say on the Jungian side, which is more interested in dreams and large-scale transformations of the imagination. Spans a huge range of philosophies and practical approaches. But there is one commonality, and it's emerged, I would say, empirically. The behaviorists discovered that if someone was afraid of something and avoiding it, and the combination of those two things are important, because there's lots of things you should be afraid of that you should avoid, like playing in traffic, because you'll just die if you go run out in the street. But imagine that you're moving towards a necessary goal, and you're pretty committed to it, and something comes up that you're afraid of, and it stops you, and now you start to avoid. Okay, and then maybe that gives you an anxiety disorder, it makes you depressed. Then the question is, what are you avoiding and why, and what should you do about it? And what the behaviorists started to do was to expose people to small doses of what they were afraid of and get them to relax. And the idea was, well, if you could learn to relax in the face of what you were afraid of, then the fear would go away. And maybe you had learned in some way to associate that with anxiety earlier. Now, it turned out that that worked, but it also turned out that it worked even if you didn't relax. And so there wasn't a learning to be calm. And then the psychoanalyst said, now that's not going to work, behaviorists, because you'll expose someone to this little fear, and because the true fear is much deeper, the fear will just reemerge somewhere else. They called that symptom substitution. And that didn't happen either, because what happened, weirdly enough, was that if you got someone to confront something they were afraid of voluntarily, then they got less afraid that was the first theory, less afraid of a whole bunch of things. So a little courage generated more, and that's a more accurate way of thinking about it. Turns out people didn't get less afraid. They got braver. And so their personality started to expand. And so what you see often, one category of people who often develop anxiety disorders are dependent women. And so those are women who've gone from sort of superordinate man to superordinate man, who've never established a sufficient individual identity. And maybe that comes back to haunt them later in life, and they develop an anxiety disorder. And maybe they're afraid to get into an elevator. So you can teach them to confront the elevator and to get in it and to take it. And then they'll go home and have a fight with their husband. And it's because they're braver. And often the husband and the rest of the family will resist this woman's attempt to become more courageous because they know what's going to happen if it's successful. But what you see is you see generalization of bravery. And every psychological school knows this. Okay, so now you asked me a theological question, so I'm going to address that. So I've been trying to understand from a psychological perspective, for example, why people have been gazing on the figure of the crucifix for 2,000 years. Now, not everyone, and doctrinal differences apart, it's still many people for 2,000 years, and that begs a question. Obviously, there's something about that image that's gripping. Okay, so now you might think, why? Well, why do people go to horror movies? Because that's pretty strange. Why in the world would you go be disgusted and terrified? Because that's sort of the essence of horror. And the answer is, because there are terrifying and disgusting things about life. And maybe you should go confront them now and then voluntarily so you get a little taste, so you can build a little courage and a little faith. And so at minimum, one of the things that the crucifixion story, the passion story represents is something like the sum of all possible tragedy. And so Jung pointed out that the passion narrative was an archetypal tragedy. And this is what he meant by that. Imagine that you took a bunch of stories that were tragic. And so you could identify them all as tragic stories. And a tragic story is something like something terrible happens to someone who doesn't deserve it. That's a tragedy. So then imagine you have 10 stories about maybe someone got betrayed by his best friend and someone fall prey to a tyranny, and someone died young and someone innocent was punished by a court, and you'd think, oh, that's tragic. And then you took all those tragedies and you took the core of the tragedy and you made it into one story. And that's, in some sense, what the passion story is. It's the sum of all possible tragedies insofar as that can be construed by the revelatory imagination. And then you might say, well, why gaze upon that? Well, the reason for that, there's a story in Exodus, it's in Numbers actually, where the Israelites are lost in the desert, like we all are. And people are losing faith because they're in the desert and not voluntarily in some true sense. And so they're losing faith. They're getting all fractious. They're fighting. They're starting to worship false idols. They're falling apart. And God gets irritated at that. And so he sends a bunch of poisonous snakes in to bite them. And you think, well, why would God do that? It's like, well, have you been alive? You know perfectly well that if you're confused and lost, and then you get bitter and disunited, that all you do is make things worse and that more snakes come up to bite you. It's like, that's life. And so the Israelites come to Moses and they say, you seem to be in quite nicely with God. Do you want to ask him to call off the snakes? Like, we're sorry, get him to call off the snakes. And so Moses has a chat with God, let's say, and God says, he doesn't call off the snakes. And so that's the thing about God is, very often, he doesn't call off the snakes, And he says instead to Moses that you have to make a staff. You have to cast a staff out of bronze. And on the staff, you have to place a serpent. And then all the Israelites have to go and look at the serpent. And if they look at the serpent, then they'll no longer be poisoned by the snakes. And then there's a section in the Gospels where Christ says something approximating that unless his figure be lifted up like the serpent in the desert, no one can be redeemed unless his figure is lifted up like the serpent in the desert, which is a very strange thing to have happen, right? Because it's a reference to this very strange story that's ancient in a very strange context many thousands of years later. But can imagine this. It's like, it's a bad thing to be confronted with snakes. And there's a real reason that the symbol for medical transformation is a stake on a staff, right? And not just associated with the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's a much older idea than that. And so, well, there's snakes, and that's bad, and you should look at them. But then there's something like the sum total of all possible snakes. And that would be all the terrible things that could happen to you in life. And then you could think, well, maybe you need a story that encompasses that territory of terrible things that you can then look on. And that's, at least in part, what the Passion story represents. Now, you can debate about whether or not it's a full account of the comprehensive tragedy of life, but like I said, I'm thinking about it psychologically. Now, there's more to it, because around that story, there's also a cloud of mythology, of associated imagery. And one of those developed dreams is something like the harrowing of hell. So not only does Christ die terribly, despite not only being innocent, but being good and being betrayed and being subject to tyranny and having to die before the eyes of his mother, all of that. But that's not enough. That hell itself has to be confronted. I would say, well, is that true of your life? It's like, well, terrible things are going to happen to you, and you better be prepared. And then you might think, well, that's too much. And if it's not too much, it's at least enough. And I would say, yeah, that'd be good to believe, but I don't think it's true, because you're actually going to have to do something like confront the reality, at least of historical atrocity and human hell, because that's part of your character too. And in order to fully reveal what you could be, then you have to contend with all of that, and you have to do it voluntarily. And so part of the reason I'm interested in that, the Christian story, let's say, is because that part of the story is where the rubber hits the road in some sense. It's like, well, that's your responsibility, is to confront the catastrophe and hellish aspect of life forthrightly. And then the question is that transformative? And one answer is, what did Nietzsche say? You know, you can tell the character of a man's spirit by determining how much truth he can tolerate. It's a very interesting way of thinking about it. This is a crushing weight, this notion, but life is going to throw its catastrophes at you, sometimes even if you're innocent. And if you're not prepared, you know, in faith, well, you're going to fold, and then it's going to be much worse. And how much do you have to face? And the answer might be every bit of it.
Do you know, on this point, thank you for that. I think that you've